like David Byrne, Talking Heads. Behind me, the house is burning down. In front of the two dopes standing, looking at us. It's a rather impactful painting that has become an icon. And being the artist that I am, and my particular, what is it? I suppose I could call it a vision, in the sense of using established, preferably more than not iconic imagery, and reworking them through my own style of painting. This is something that has been going through the history of art from as long back. I don't know. I guess even people who painted on caves looked at the other guy's bison and did his version of it, said, hey, yeah, that's a neat animal. So the idea of riffing off, or doing a cover, as it's called in music, is not perfectly ubiquitous in art history, and the desire among creative people to present something of originality seems always to have hinged on the subject or the story that is being told, but it's almost impossible to tell any. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but almost impossible to be original from the point of view of telling a story that has never been told. And I'm thinking now specifically in terms of a story as it's being told in terms of subject matter, which is why artists enjoy riffing off another artist who riffed off another artist, adding their own particular juice to it. And well, in this particular version back here, it's a famous image by Grant Wood, and it's called American Gothic. Anyway, I thought I'd just create a bit of a context to this snowball gathering more and more material as it rolls down the hill. It's a beer virus snowball with the little spikes coming off it, rolling down the hill, gathering more and more material over the last 2 years. It just seems to be picking up pace in many different ways. And there is the internet, the social media platforms, all that kind of virtual interaction that people have has very likely escalated the situation in the sense that, on both sides, good and bad, in the sense that things are kind of getting bigger and rolling along bigger. And the idea that the owners that are behind this operation really care is quite evidently not existent. The owners really don't feel threatened whatsoever. There may be some opinion about this, that they're running scared and this and that. Well, I think it's kind of like the scorpion that stings, that story. That's what they do. The owners sting. They get on your back as you're taking them across the river, and in the middle they sting, and then they go down as well. This is a very famous metaphor, parable, if you want. And the owners exist in order to sting. It's their proclivity, it's their nature. It's the depravity as we have understood it is their nature. So I reflected on this whole thing about posting and people giving their opinions about the nature of reality. And there are some very, very good people out there analyzing the situation that we're in. My premise has always been that we all, collectively, we all know. And this knowledge comes through our own personal experience, having been exposed to lies, the things that happened probably fairly early on in our lives, even before we were 5, most likely before we were 5. Ask maybe Jordan Peterson, the Swami in Canada, Jordan Peterson, the Swami of fuck, who seems to know everything clinically psychological, and people are just screaming to every word that he says. We need to hear everything he says, especially his analysis of biblical metaphors or biblical stories. He seems to have the insight on all of these things. And as Chomsky said, people deserve their intellectuals. And like in, not just Canada, he's making an impact everywhere. Why did I bring him up? Okay, so his clinical psychology would enlighten us as to the nature of our reality based on early conditioning. And I think this is quite obvious that people are conditioned early on. And every individual, as far as my own sense of things are, we make choices, but those choices become more and more limited as we become habitual or reactionary to something that we necessarily are not. It's not in the front of our mind. It's not on the frontal lobe part of our brain, wherever that is, the conscious part of our brain. It's somewhat more of an unconscious thing. And I think that this snowball, this beer virus running down the hill and gathering speed is just part of that conditioning that has happened from very early on. And I have said many times in videos that people, parents primarily, but people hate children. Where does that come from? And how dare you say that? Parents provide everything possible in the Western world, probably even in the developing nations, although I'm not that familiar with developing nations. But, parents and people are really always concerned about children. And so I'm sorry to break that bubble, but what is understood to be concern and caring is actually something that is for sure less than helpful, although maybe not through bad intent. I'm not saying that a person necessarily intends to harm their child, but because there is no inner work, that we're not encouraged to do an inner work to understand ourselves better, we are reactionary to things. We are habitual. We go through patterns of actions and pass it on to the children, who learn early on that this is the way we survive in the world. We get used to abuse, even though it's called education or religion or all those lovely things that we get introduced into. The ritualized behavior called culture or even civilization is something that introduces the innocent to a way of behaving that is quite abusive. This is my contention. And to the extent, I mean, it's on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst, even good intentions often lead to very bad results. In children, I'm saying. And the children end up doing what they were done to, even though within the consensual mind frame, people say, oh no, children are loved and cared for, as we see now. We are being abused by the owners who were children themselves abused, like here in Canada. The Trudeau boy is extremely abusive in terms of his heavy-handedness, as whatever semblance of civilization and culture was existing prior to the beer virus. It has escalated in people such as an owner like Trudeau, a dynasty. His father was a prime minister. His mother was abused by the father. I have no doubt all the children, the Trudeau children, must have been abused from what I can tell, considering how he's acting toward the entire population, which are his flock, which are his under his care, so to speak. And it begins to escalate this sense of it's almost a kind of feeling that I imagine a feeling of futility or helplessness, that children have a sense of helplessness along with a feeling of futility, because number one, they're very small. They feel there really is no alternative to the adult world. You can withdraw and become pathological in your withdrawing from the world, and I think many children do in their own way, even though they appear to be functioning. But this is something that is systemic and is the cause of the snowball rolling down the hill, getting bigger and bigger, and people just seem to be standing underneath it and getting rolled over by it. And my conclusion is that part of this pathology of the abuse that happens to every person on some level, from a scale of 1 to 10, some more severely than others. And interestingly, there seems to be, from what I observe, an ability to actually choose to be better, even though you had a very bad history in quite a number of people, or let's say in some people I've met. I know that their history was quite extreme in terms of the abuse and the negligence and the lack of love, and even to a certain extent a hatefulness. They turn out to be extraordinary human beings. There is leftovers. There are things that they occasionally will exhibit as being dysfunctional in terms of this hateful behavior, but stop themselves because they have a conscience, like I say, wherever that is. The conscience kicks in and says, oh, I got to do the right thing because it's for myself, primarily, to do the right thing. It's not for anyone else, it's for myself. This is that inner work, being to this voice that is called a conscience. So my point today.
What I wanted to say to people that are quite frustrated. I talked to a friend, another artist who lives in New York, or used to live in New York. He's outside of New York now. And he can't understand how people are so willing to accept this fraud. He can't understand what it is that have put people or how he observed that people are so compliant with this obvious lie. You don't need to have a lot of analytical skills like Jordan Peterson to recognize that there is something terribly wrong for the owners to have a 24/7 PR campaign on a pandemic. A pandemic will express itself. You don't need to be told how bad it is in order to understand you're in a pandemic. Bring out your dead. Monty Python, bring out your dead. So what is it? My friend said he's just totally perplexed and angry how people can just completely capitulate to the owners the way they are. I mean, there's always been a level of capitulation. If you want to exist in society, you have to go along and get along sometimes, I guess. Some people just don't. Anyway, my point is, I said to him, John, this is what I think, that through this conditioning that we've had as children, we are actually quite used to the abuse. So this is like a self-feeding thing. It's like it feeds on itself. Once the abuse starts and you're comfortable in your skin with it, you never really are comfortable, but you're kind of accepting it, that's how things are, then this gets passed on. And the only thing that stands between this ritualization, this continuous abuse thing being passed on, is a conscience. This is why I say the conscience is the most important aspect of our nature. A lot of people say, well, if you just love, and yes, sure, if you have a totally loving person, all this kind of thing. But I would prefer to be among people of conscience, and the loving thing, I think, will sort itself out once that is in place. And what I felt and what I said was that after a while, there is nothing else other than abuse. And it's called, in clinical terms, I think it's called Stockholm Syndrome. So this is what has happened, that the reason people are so completely, 9 out of 10 or more, are completely going along with this abusive owner, the abusive owners we've given them since way back when. If you go back to Akhenaten, people handed over the reign to the horses of civilization because Akhenaten was the direct
he said he's the direct liaison to the omnipotent being, and after that, everything is history, and we just have to follow the oligarchic rulers and owners, and reinforced the way it was reinforced in the owners, that abuse is the only level of relationship that we truly care and appreciate in our lives. So that's why the Stockholm Syndrome idea, the captive begins to admire and even love the abuser, the captor, who is terrible in their behavior, but the victim still is attracted and attached to that abuse. It happens on many different levels in our society, from misogyny and the bully beats up the weaker person and gets away with it, and then eventually the weaker person is so distraught and the brain cells are fried. The only emotion left is one that, oh, that's what love really feels like. So I think this is what I said to my friend, that we're in a situation, the population as a whole, for whatever reason, needs to go through this experience. And there are people saying that, well, we're going to come out on the other end. And there's so much dogma around this as well, like the God dogma and the biblical times and end times. There has never been, I don't think there has ever been a time in human history when there wasn't some really nefarious shit going down in some form or other. Now, the fact that this is so epic in terms of a global sense, in terms of a global compliance and a very well coordinated effort to take down the individual into this most rudimentary form of relationship, which is abuse-abuser. This is now ubiquitous. It appears, some places worse than others, like Australia and Canada not far off, about the uninjected people who refuse to submit to an untested medical procedure. This is something that is now escalating. The ball is getting bigger, and the only thing that stands in the way from us being totally squashed and crushed by this is a conscience. I point to my head because conscience quite often relies on thought. Thought being like sensible, reasonable thought, but it originates down in a center that is much more connected to the love principle of things, that the conscience feeds on love and that feeling of caring and wanting to be a better person. This is what conscience seems to be, thrives. Conscience thrives on this because it's very gratifying to do the right thing. People, I can tell you from personal experience, it's very gratifying to do the right thing, and if I've done the wrong thing, to set it right, to fix it as best I can, to always make sure that I fix whatever I knocked over instead of the bull leaving the china shop all broken. I like to fix the stuff, and it feels better for me. It's not for anyone else, it's for me. So that was my conclusion about the beer virus and the ongoing, the lie of this. It's never been about a virus. It's been obviously to see the extent to which this can be activated. This feeling of love your abuser. How far can we go to activate this feeling in people, which is predicated on a childhood that was full of abuse? The reason 9 out of 10 people are actually relating to this is because this is their childhood. People's early days were exactly what they're experiencing now, and they're attracted to it. That's what I say. This is what I feel. And the people that are resisting it actually had an epiphany of their own conscience kicking in and saying, I can be better, even though, in a different scale, in different levels. I think it's different for all people. It's like I said, from scale of 1 to 10, I don't know if there is a 0, maybe there is. Then you're sort of like, I don't know what type of person you are if you had 0 abuse, but if you're like a lesser victim of parental abuse, and again, I want to say that parents themselves were abused, so they haven't got a clue. They just react. They're ritualistic. They're reenacting the thing that they were taught. So do they have responsibility? 100%. 100%, because I say a conscience exists in everyone. So we can make that decision, but it really does take the inner work. We have to look at ourselves and realize who we really are as people. And quite, John was saying, he's a really excellent artist. He was saying that he can't understand how people, creative people, who are supposedly searching and looking at stuff and understanding, how en masse they have completely capitulated, especially when you get into that iconic level of person who's recognized for their extraordinary abilities, the Justin Bieber types, and all the Kevin Spaceys and Travolta's, the entire gamut of useless humans that populate our iconic. They've never produced anything of value in terms of really valuable, meaning that they give people a chance to look at themselves and become better in themselves. Very clever. I saw a fabulous film last night called what the heck was it called? It was about a young Jewish boy in Poland who witnessed the murder of his parents, and the sister ran away. What a powerful, excellent film. I'll put it below the name. It'll come to me. I'll attach it. But it was an incredibly well-made film by a Canadian producer who ranks high, as far as I know, on my list of reptile film people. I got this through Schellenberger, who had firsthand knowledge of this producer Langus or Langdon or some BC guy, and they make these phenomenal. They produce these phenomenal creative works. This was a film, and it was like extraordinary. There was some terrific stuff in this about the nature of our reality, how we overcome the trauma of the abuse that we suffered, and how this person he became a writer. And anyway, it's really worth seeing this film. I highly recommend it. But it goes back to the idea that, yes, from a scale of 1 to 10, we have levels of suffering, and to overcome that means intense introspection and understanding of who we really are, and then living our birthright, becoming the best we can be in terms of the person with the gifts and whatever it is that we were given by the omnipotent being within this mystery. So yeah, it's a massive Stockholm syndrome that has manifested itself based on my conclusion that 9 out of 10 children have such severe experiences of growing up that they naturally, their proclivity is to search out and look for whenever this is happening. And the owners, the oligarchs, they understand this because they themselves were abused. They're abusers. I just saw a report, apparently, Trudeau boy had a non-disclosure agreement with a minor that he allegedly has abused. And well, this came up, I don't know, a friend of mine sent me this connection. So the owners themselves were abused, and then they continue to abuse, and they can't help themselves. They just do it. They do it. And he's doing it not just even individually abusing a child, or a minor, as they said in this report, abusing a minor. They're abusing the entire gamut of minorness, which is the population. So just as a context, what I like to do is create a context, and I'm not the first to suggest this, that these mandates and all the regulations and directives that have nothing to do with the reality are being followed because people need to be abused. They relate to that kind of relationship, and that's what we're in, unfortunately. Maybe I'll do a video to talk about how this could end. I've suggested it already. This is going to end when people start to respond to the conscience that might or may not be anymore. I don't know, but I think most people still have a conscience on some level or other. Once that kicks in, the whole thing will stop. That's what I think. All the best.